I'm going to start the conference now. Can you hear me, Peter?
Yes, I can hear you. Do you want me to put my camera on?
No, I'm going to start the conference now. Okay, so thank you and welcome everyone and good morning from England. I'm Dr. Bayas Ahmed, a lecturer at the Institute for Risk and Disaster Reduction at UCL. And today I am hosting the conference and I have a number of panelists and colleagues here as a co-host. So the conference is on the Rohingya crisis in comparative perspective. This is our second edition. The first conference was held at UCL in July 2019. So the conference is funded by the British Academy and the Royal Society, but also it represents our different activities at UCL IRDR and also as part of our work through the UCL Humanitarian Institute. The conference is jointly organized by the Institute for Risk and Disaster Reduction at UCL and the Center for Genocide Studies at the University of Dhaka. So now I would like to welcome Professor Peter Salmons. He is the head of the department at UCL IRDR, and he also the principal investigator of two different projects funded by British Academy and Royal Society. So Peter, please give your welcome speech. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Bayas, and welcome to everybody joining us for this conference. So this is the second international conference on the Rohingya crisis in comparative perspective. I'm Peter Salmons. I'm director of the Institute for Risk and Disaster Reduction, and I welcome you to UCL. I will just now share my screen and say a few things about the conference. Hopefully you can all see my screen there.
Yes, Peter.
So this is a two-day virtual conference. We'll bring together scholars, activists, policymakers, humanitarian workers and donors to share their evidence-based findings and actionable experience of the Rohingya crisis and humanitarian actions undertaken by national and international authorities. It covers a range of topics, especially targeting but not limited to the following: COVID-19 challenges in the camps, natural hazard perspectives in the camps, Rohingya case studies from India, Malaysia, the USA, Indonesia, and Saudi Arabia, comparative perspectives of refugee case studies in the contemporary time, Rohingya crisis in Bangladesh, in conversation with Rohingya activists, international courts of justice and justice issues, and the Rohingya crisis, documentary, photo exhibition, and arts. The program today, to the Zoom login and my welcome speech, and then a welcome by Professor Imtiaz Ahmed. We'll have our inaugural session and keynote speech by Mr. Robert Chatterton Dixon, the British High Commissioner for the People's Republic of Bangladesh. This will be moderated by Professor Imtiaz Ahmed. There'll then be a short tea break, followed by a panel discussion on COVID-19 challenges in the camps, moderated by Professor Amina Molshin. There'll then be a lunch break, followed by a panel discussion on natural hazards perspectives, which I will moderate. Following this will be Rohingya case studies presented from India, Malaysia, and Saudi Arabia, moderated by Dr. Kazi Famida Fazana. Again, a short tea break, and the final session will be a panel discussion on human rights and refugee advocacy, activist perspectives, moderated by Dr. Jessica Field. Day 2 of the program, again, there'll be the Zoom login at 9:30 to 10. The first session is a panel discussion on the Rohingya crisis and Bangladesh, moderated by Dr. Tawhid Islam. A short tea break will be followed by an in-conversation piece with Rohingya activists, moderated by Dr. Niloy Biswas. Following the lunch break, there'll be a panel discussion on the International Courts of Justice and justice issues, moderated by Professor Imtiaz Ahmed. Following a short tea break, there'll then be the Rohingya crisis, a documentary, photo exhibition and arts, moderated by Dr. Bayaz Ahmed. Then there'll be closing remarks by Ms. Saida Muna Tasneem, the High Commissioner for Bangladesh to the United Kingdom, and with myself and Professor Imtiaz Ahmed. So we have an exciting program ahead of us these next 2 days, and I hope you can join us for the whole program. I just want to say a little bit about the UCL Institute for Risk and Disaster Reduction. This is our 2020 annual report. This is our 10th year of the Institute. The front cover of our report, which you can download from our website, obviously shows the coronavirus, which has not only dominated our lives, but actually very influential on our research directions this last year. But it hasn't all been coronavirus. I just want to sort of pick out a few things from our 2020 report. We welcome the appointments of Dr. Poonam Yadav and Dr. Jessica Field as lecturers in humanitarian studies. A new BSc Global Humanitarian Studies program was approved by the UCL Education Committee and will start in 2021. We won over £8 million of competitive research funding from UKRI, Belmont Forum, the Royal Society and the British Academy. And we responded to the coronavirus crisis with initiatives including the IRDR COVID-19 laboratory, My Lockdown Journal, and the European-wide perception survey, COVID-19 emergency recovery and improvement. The IRDR has global reach. We work on Arctic risk projects, Bangladesh, of course, in terms of landslides, water risks, Rohingya crisis, Nigeria and public health apps, the Philippines looking at housing, shelter and safer schools, climate change in Mauritius, community resilience in Oman, and so on. And I think out of this sort of global reach has come our new BSc program, which I just want to introduce to you. This is our BSc Global Humanitarian Studies, a 3-year full-time program. So the BSc program aims to educate and train future generations of humanitarian leaders in the theory and practice of humanitarian action. It's a distinctive multidisciplinary program which will enable students to gain an understanding of the emergence, impacts and response to humanitarian crises. While the critical and analytical skills acquired, grounded in practice, will equip students to anticipate and manage evolving humanitarian threats. If you're interested, do please contact the undergraduate admissions tutor, who is Dr. Bayaz Ahmed, on humanitarian-info@ucl.ac.uk. We're also admitting students now for our master's programs, again, to start in September 2021. We have our Risk, Disaster and Resilience MSc, which also has a management pathway. We have our Risk and Disaster Science MSc, which has space risks and data science pathways. And we have a Risk and Disaster Reduction MRes, it's a Master of Research. It's a full-time 1 year or part-time for 2 years. And if you're interested, please contact the IRDR admissions tutor on irdr-inquiries@ucl.ac.uk. So thank you very much for joining us in this conference. I believe it's going to be a very stimulating 2 days ahead of us. And I will now hand over to Professor Imtiaz Ahmed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. Uh, Welcome to all of you. I always say good earth because we're not really sure whether it's good morning or afternoon or evening. You may be anywhere in the world. So, good earth to all of you. I think the lineup that we have today, particularly for this session, and of course the panels, and also tomorrow, is extraordinary. Uh, it only shows that the issue of the Rohingyas are getting, greater attention, not only in Bangladesh but around the world. And I say this with confidence because back in the 70s and the 90s, we did have the exodus, but this time it looks that global attention has increased to an extent which I don't think we can match that with 70s and the 90s. And one of the main reason I believe, of course, this time the exodus has happened for totally different reasons, and that is we all the indication shows that a genocide was committed, and also something that in the 70s and 90s we did not see was that the whole issue is now with the ICJ, ICC, not to mention the Argentinian court. We never had anything of that back in the 70s and the 90s. So I think the global attention and the very partnership that we have with UCL and Dhaka University is also extraordinary in the sense that this is something that we never uh, happened, and we never thought back in the 70s and 90s that something of this kind will happen. It only shows greater interest of the people, and I hope the Myanmar government would realize that this is not going to go away. Now, what has changed? Well, Peter has alluded to a lot of things. Some of the things that I just want to flag, one or two things before we go into the keynote presentation by His Excellency, the British High Commissioner, and also we are keenly waiting to listen to His Excellency, the Foreign Secretary, Mr. Masood bin Momen. Um One is, of course, the whole issue of pandemic is something that we need to keep note of. The one, and this is also something very surprising, when the COVID-19 pandemic came, there are a lot of news as to what will happen to the Rohingyas. At least up until now, we can say that it's relatively, I think, the government has managed in a way which very few people thought could be done. I'm sure the Foreign Secretary would have more to say about that. Um, the second point is the whole issue of ICJ is also very important. If you see our last year and this year, the first conference or the second conference, we never had the provisional judgment, and not to mention the very fact the Rohingya identity has been recognized by the ICJ is also extraordinary. Finally, the point that I want to mention that whatever we do, the gaze ought to be Myanmar. I'm surprised that sometimes the gaze, there's more attention to Bangladesh, and even when this issue of Bhashan Chor, I'm sure people would be talking probably the next 2 days. It surprises me because I wish the global media and the national media would provide more attention to Myanmar. Sometimes the attention is also misplaced. The recent election that happened in Myanmar, the very fact that they have incumbent military officers in the parliament, to call that a democratic election, to call that an election at all, I find it personally, I find it surprising. Uh, so I'm sure next 2 days we will be talking about some of the things, and myself, I will be back again. We have a panel on ICJ tomorrow, but welcome to all of you. And I'm sure your contribution would help to resolve one of the big issues of 21st century, mainly to deliver justice to a group of people who have been denied justice for years. Now, with that, may I now call upon His Excellency Mr. Robert Chatterton Dixon, the British High Commissioner to the People's Republic of Bangladesh, to deliver his keynote presentation. Robert, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Imtiaz. Foreign Secretary, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's good evening and good morning, as we've said, depending on where you are. But it's very good to be here. First thing I'd like to do is to share my congratulations to the Centre for Genocide Studies and UCL's Institute for Risk and Disaster Management for convening this second international conference on the Rohingya crisis in comparative perspective, and bringing together such an auspicious group of expert speakers from across civil society to discuss what is unquestionably one of the most important issues impacting the region. And I'm really grateful for being invited to deliver a keynote speech, because as British High Commissioner in Bangladesh for nearly 2 years now, I can say that the two issues that have most consistently and continuously occupied my attention, one has been climate change, which is existential for Bangladesh and crucial for us as chairs of COP26, but the other has been unquestionably the Rohingya crisis in all its different manifestations. So it's very good to have the opportunity in the next couple of days to step back and hear more from experts. I'm very happy to call the Centre for Genocide Studies and Professor Imtiaz a long-standing friend of the High Commission, and we've had many conversations, Imtiaz, about the challenges and complexities of how we approach and resolve the Rohingya crisis. This is obviously going to be another one over the next couple of days, and I look forward to many more following the conference. Because it's really essential, I think, for civil society, academia and policymakers to come together to engage and share experiences in order to ensure that policy is sound and evidence-based. And over the next couple of days, we're obviously going to hear many fascinating presentations and participate in challenging discussions as we consider how to reduce the vulnerabilities of the Rohingya people where they are now and increase the likelihood and possibility of their returning home. And looking at the conference program, I particularly commend the organisers for including the Rohingya people, because all too often international community debates and discussions about the complexities of the Rohingya crisis don't, I think, sufficiently involve the Rohingya people themselves. And they are people with agency, and it's crucial that we hear from and consult them when we are talking about them. They must be front and centre in decisions that are made about their future, and it's therefore very important that we nurture and empower Rohingya civil society so that the Rohingyas can be represented wherever they are. Another thing that I think is very valuable about this event is the opportunity to draw on other refugee crises globally, both worldwide and in the region, and consider how in the past these crises, which always seem so intractable at the time, can end up being resolved. And we can look at what works and what didn't work, and try and find where we can actionable lessons. And one particular example that's sometimes cited here, including, I have to say, by Lord Malloch Brown when he was here last year, was the example of the Cambodian refugees who seemed like such a difficult, who seemed to be in such a difficult situation in large camps in Thailand 40 years ago, and who nonetheless were eventually enabled to return. So even the crises that can seem most difficult, and the Rohingya crisis does seem very difficult to those of us who are working on it, nonetheless, there is always a way through. These are political events, and there are solutions in the end if the will is there. So I think this is a really good opportunity to look at what has been learned elsewhere and how those lessons can be applied. I also think it's very good that accountability and justice feature in the programme, because it's very clear that the Rohingya left because of atrocities that were committed against them very specifically in Rakhine State in 2017. And it's very important that we look, as this conference does, at the prosecution of the perpetrators of human rights violations, how that can lead on to restitution, and how that can help to create an environment in Rakhine that allows the Rohingya to return home voluntarily, safely, and with dignity, and with confidence. And again, it's crucial in this that we listen to the Rohingyas themselves. And of course, when we're thinking about accountability, it is noticeable that it's almost a year since the Gambia brought its historic case against Myanmar to the ICJ in The Hague. And of course, very unusually, Daw Aung San Suu Kyi, who is not often seen these days on the international stage, felt that she had to go to The Hague to defend Myanmar. And she acknowledged for the first time that members of the Tatmadaw, the Myanmar armed forces, may have committed what amounted to war crimes. And since then, we've seen the court apply provisional measures against Myanmar. And we, of course, as the UK, now that we have once more an independent sanctions policy, have introduced our own national sanctions against the Commander-in-Chief and his deputy. So we can see that although these things are not fast, there are accountability mechanisms gearing up for what was done to the Rohingyas. And I'll say a little bit more about that a little later. Of course, we also have to imagine, I mean, the whole fact that we're having this conference in this format means that we are constantly reminded of COVID and the impact that it's had on all sorts of crises and conflicts around the world. And I have to say, when we were in the High Commission looking at vulnerabilities in Bangladesh as the COVID crisis erupted, we were very concerned about the vulnerability of this population densely packed in difficult conditions in Cox's Bazar. But I have to say, one of the remarkable successes of this year has been that with swift and targeted assistance from the humanitarian community, the action of the authorities in Cox's Bazar and by the refugees themselves, I'm very pleased that the refugee population has proved less vulnerable to COVID than we had initially feared. But clearly, all over the world, despite the promising news that we're seeing every day at the moment about vaccines, we as humanity have yet to defeat the virus, and we may never be able to do that completely. So we cannot afford to be complacent about the fact of such a large and vulnerable population of refugees and their immediate neighbours in Cox's Bazar. And I'm very pleased to say that the UK supported this effort to protect the refugee population against COVID through committing £11 million to mitigate the impact of the COVID crisis in Cox's Bazar, including for local Bangladeshi communities. And what we did helped to create capacity for over 600 beds for treating refugees and host communities suffering from severe respiratory infections. And I saw this in my most recent visit to Cox's Bazar a couple of months ago. I have to say it's very impressive what you can do in creating clinical facilities out of bamboo and plastic sheeting, which nonetheless have the ability to deliver a really remarkable medical outcome. So there have been some good things in the response, and I have to say it is obviously very encouraging that the disaster that we thought might sweep through the camps when COVID first appeared has not so far done that. And at the more micro level, we've added more than 2,400 hand washing stations to the camps, and we've tried to make sure that the refugee population and the host communities together have access to public health information. And we've supported that with surge deployments from UK emergency medical teams. And of course, in any discussion of the Rohingya crisis, we need to talk also about Bangladesh. And it's very timely to be holding this conference now, because next month is the beginning of 2021. And of course, the Golden Jubilee year for Bangladesh as it celebrates its 50th anniversary of independence. And of course, it's particularly important because Bangladesh really had a forming experience in refugee crisis of its own. Both as refugees, but as many of the population found themselves as refugees in India in 1971, and then in subsequent decades as the host to multiple influxes of refugees from Myanmar. So Bangladesh, I think more than almost any other country in the world, has experience of refugee crises, what the impact of those crises is at either end, both as refugees and as hosts of refugees, the human impact, and what can be done to try and resolve these crises. And I have to say at this point that I am constantly struck by the extraordinary generosity and patience of both the government and the people of Bangladesh in continuing to accommodate such a substantial refugee population. But I think it's worth just saying, I mean, I think my starting point whenever I'm asked about this or I'm thinking about this is that we need to acknowledge that this crisis we're dealing with now is on a different scale. And I think the point is that it's bad for Bangladesh, clearly. It's very bad for the Rohingyas, but I would also argue it's bad for Myanmar and it's bad for the region. So I think when you're looking at reasons why we should all try and resolve this crisis, we need to recognize just what a serious impact it's having and what a multiplicity of ways that impact is being visible. If we take the first of these, why it's bad for Bangladesh, I mean, it's very obvious that this crisis places a huge burden on Bangladesh. And when you go to Cox's Bazar, it's very clear that there are economic and environmental impacts which are getting worse over time. There's a major social impact, but we're also seeing increasing violence in the camps, increasing signs of the pathologies that tend to exhibit themselves when people are left in limbo for long periods. And we're seeing both criminality and gang violence in the camps. And we're also, of course, so far seeing a largely latent but nonetheless real possibility of radicalization and extremism. So if you put all of those things together, you can see what a burden all of this represents for Bangladesh. And it particularly represents a burden for already vulnerable host communities whose own access to education and economic opportunity is limited. And those communities are themselves vulnerable sometimes to the activities of malign actors in a part of the country that has always been vulnerable to some extent to a sort of border economy and to smuggling into illicit activities. And all of this, of course, the presence of a very large number of refugees living in limbo naturally tends to lead to an increase in violence, trafficking, gender-based violence, forced marriage, and child marriage. And these are all concerns. And of course, as I said, complemented also by the possibility of radicalization and extremism in the longer term. So what we have seen is the extraordinary challenge that this crisis represents for Bangladesh. And as I say, we think that the people in Bangladesh and Cox's Bazar deserve recognition for their generosity, for the way they opened their homes and offered to act as hosts for the Rohingya people as they fled the atrocities. But we cannot say that the crisis is anything other than bad for Bangladesh. It's also bad for the Rohingyas. It's a particular tragedy. I visited the camps many times since I arrived in Dhaka almost 2 years ago. Each time I go to the camps, I'm struck by the resilience and energy of the refugee population. I'm also struck, I have to say, in my most recent visit by how much greener and better organized the camp environment seems to be. There's been a very effective tree planting campaign, and the camp looks a much less scarred environment than it did. But of course, all of that means also that people are tending to put down roots and stay for longer. And no one would choose to live in limbo in a refugee camp. And of course, especially the people who wouldn't choose to live there are the thousands of children who have been born there. And I have to say, it is very striking as you go around the camp, just how many small children there are and just how vulnerable that population is, clearly, how much that population needs and deserves a resolution to this crisis. And it's also clear when you're in the camps that the Rohingya refugee population really want to go home. I always try and make sure I meet Rohingyas when I'm there, and it's always possible to do that. And I have to say they are very clear and united on their, first of all, their gratitude to the people of Bangladesh for being looked after, their gratitude to the international community, but also their very strong urge and wish to return to their homes in Rakhine. So we in the UK are and will continue to be vocal advocates for voluntary, safe and dignified returns for the people, because that we think is the only long-term solution. For the 860,000 people who are living as refugees, deprived of access to their families, communities, homes and property, and crucially, of course, denied citizenship to their homeland, and in the case of the children, denied access to education and training, and in the case of adults, denied the opportunity to make a living and support themselves and their families. And of course, we're also very conscious that there is at the moment a 600,000 strong Rohingya population remaining in Rakhine, who also have limited access to rights, an uncertain status and face systemic discrimination. So it needs a resolution to the crisis on both sides of the border. So the crisis is bad for Bangladesh, it's very bad for the Rohingyas, but I think it's also bad for Myanmar, because Myanmar has been striving to make the transition from decades of military rule, or one might say misrule, to becoming a fledgling democracy and finding its place within the international community. And of course, just last month, we saw what appears to have been a successful election in Myanmar, a very strong victory for the National League for Democracy. The constitutional process for forming a government is now playing out. So we can see the elements of Myanmar returning to the family and community of nations. But it's fair to say that the Rohingya crisis and the opprobrium and processes and legal issues associated with that have been a huge setback for that goal. And we can also say that the crisis is bad for the Indo-Pacific region, because there are great plans for linking Bangladesh, India, Myanmar, and other parts of Southeast Asia through economic corridors, through railways, through ports, through power connectivity, through all sorts of positive things which would enable clean and sustainable growth. And many of those projects and plans are currently stymied because of the instability in Rakhine, of which the Rohingya crisis is one of the most serious manifestations. And of course, this matters not just to the people of this region, but also to the wider Indo-Pacific, which is, of course, a region of increasing geostrategic importance as we see economic, political, and military power shift towards Asia, which is clearly going to be one of the global developments of this century. So we in the UK recognise that the crisis was caused in Myanmar. The solution lies there, but we are partners in the Indo-Pacific region and further afield, and we feel ourselves a moral responsibility with our partners to try and help resolve the crisis. And more than 3 years on from the start of this most recent influx, there has been a lot of rhetoric, and we're very keen to work with others to try and move beyond rhetoric. And we do think, in looking at how we can create the conditions for return, which, as I say, is clearly what is needed to resolve this crisis, there is a role for Myanmar's partners, including its partners in ASEAN, to work with Myanmar to persuade the government there that it's in everybody's best interest to resolve the root causes of the conflict and enable returns. We recognise that this won't be easy. Rakhine is the second poorest state of Myanmar, and of course there are multiple trust deficits to address between the state and the Rohingyas, between the state and the wider Rakhine people, and between the Rohingyas themselves and the wider population of Rakhine. So none of this is easy, and of course we recognise the wider governance challenges in Myanmar, but it's a state with more than one armed insurrection and conflict going on within its borders. But we do think that because the crisis in Rakhine has had such a particular international impact, it will be right for the government of Myanmar to work particularly closely with its international partners as the new government is formed to take significant steps towards resolving the crisis. And I think when you look at it, it's actually not too difficult to see some of the ingredients, some of the elements that the new government in Myanmar could look to bring in order to create the conditions in Rakhine that would give the Rohingyas the confidence to return. The first thing that could happen is a de-escalation of the conflict in Rakhine state. It seems unlikely that the Rohingya people will feel safe enough to return to conflict in Rakhine. And it is actually encouraging that in the last 2 weeks, particularly since the election, we have seen a major decline in violence in Rakhine. We don't know yet whether that is going to be temporary or long-term. It's obviously, we think, very much in everyone's interest that it continues. And it would be really excellent if that can happen and if the new government can make that one of its priorities. But it does show that violence is not necessarily headed in one way only in Rakhine. It is possible for the actors there to decide that violence is not the way forward. If we're looking at the wider situation in Rakhine, then of course we have the huge benefit of already having a blueprint, if you like, for some of the changes that could be made to increase economic and social inclusion in Rakhine. The Rakhine Advisory Commission was really the last thing that Kofi Annan, the former UN Secretary General, was working on before he died. The Rakhine Advisory Commission report of 2017 is a comprehensive document that addresses the root cause of the crisis. And we think that implementation of the Commission's recommendations will provide a very good basis for ensuring that return can take place and be sustainable. Another element that would clearly be beneficial would be to offer the Rohingya a pathway to citizenship, to give them the same rights and protections according to others in Myanmar's diverse population, because it is an oddity that in a state that recognises 136 different ethnicities, the Rohingya who have been in Rakhine for generations do not have that recognition. And finally, as I say, we think there's a very important point around accountability for perpetrators of atrocities that were committed in Rakhine in August of 2017 particularly. And in particular, of course, we would like to see Myanmar adhere to the provisional measures that were recommended by the International Court of Justice earlier this year. So we think the elements are there. It's very important that returns can take place. And we think that some of the elements are there. We recognise that Myanmar is not a country that welcomes or necessarily responds well to pressure, but we do think that reasoned argument can be applied. And what we try to do is to use our role on the UN Security Council as penholder, as it's called, on Myanmar, to keep the Rohingya crisis in the spotlight and make sure that the world does not forget that there is the largest group of stateless people in the world living in one place, living in Cox's Bazar. Now, I'm not going to pretend that action in the Security Council is easy, and it's quite clear that there are members of the Security Council who do not particularly value or welcome progress on this dossier. But what we do try to do is work with partners in the Security Council and on the UN Human Rights Council to establish the mandates for the fact-finding mission for Myanmar, the FFMM, and the independent investigative mechanism for Myanmar, so that we have evidence on which decisions and processes can be based. And in particular, the fact-finding mission for Myanmar is widely accepted as the core document that describes and analyses the atrocities committed in Rakhine State, while the latter provides a mechanism that is preserving and collecting evidence of those same atrocities to make sure that judicial processes are credible and evidence-based. And just this year, as the evidence accumulates, we've convened the UN Security Council 3 times, most recently in September, to discuss the ICJ case, the impact of COVID, the Myanmar elections, and the conflict in Rakhine. And as I said, bilaterally in July, for the first time, we had a first list of sanctions that we were able to apply unilaterally following our exit from the European Union. And on the list of the first group of people to whom we applied those sanctions were the 2 top Myanmar generals who've been identified by the fact-finding mission for Myanmar as being responsible for directing the atrocities in Rakhine State. And I think the fact that these individuals, the Commander-in-Chief of the Tatmadaw and his deputy, were the first to be included in our initial list of new global human rights sanctions tells its own story about how appalled we in the UK were by the horrendous events in Rakhine. So as I said earlier, returns need to be voluntary, safe and dignified. And another word that's important in this is sustainable, because we've seen successive waves of Rohingya being forced to leave Rakhine. And it's very important that when the Rohingya do return next time, that is sustainable. And all of us, I think, in this room, one way or another, have a role to play in trying to ensure that this is the case. However, it's worth saying returns is clearly the right solution to this, but setting the conditions for return will take time. And even if returns started tomorrow, the process would still take a while. So in the meantime, it's obviously essential that the humanitarian operation in Cox's Bazar is sustained to provide for and protect the refugees until they can return home. We are, I think, the second largest, we as the UK are the second largest donor. We've contributed £294 million to the humanitarian operation since August of 2017. And what we've done is ensure that, as well as receiving basic humanitarian aid, protection and other services, the refugees have access to education, skills and livelihoods. And there's been some progress in these areas, particularly on education, skills and livelihoods, but there is more to be done. Because by enabling the refugees to earn their own living, first of all, we decrease their reliance on humanitarian aid and increase their sense of dignity. And secondly, we reduce the risk of their turning to criminality, which, as I said, is increasingly clearly a problem. And of course, it also helps them to return to Myanmar and to contribute to their society by making sure that they have skills to do that. And we and others in the international community have not forgotten the Rohingya refugees. In October, an international conference which we hosted alongside our partners in the US, the European Union and UNHCR raised $600 million to support the humanitarian operation in Cox's Bazar and elsewhere, which I think is particularly impressive as a sum when you look at how national economies everywhere are stressed by the outcome of the pandemic. It's also worth noting, over the last few days, we've seen reports in the media of the government here in Bangladesh's plans to ease pressures in the camps by relocating some Rohingya refugees from Cox's Bazar to Bhasan Char in the next few days. And I think I should finish by just saying a little bit about that, not least because British ministers and parliamentarians have been following that issue closely. And we absolutely recognise the huge amount of work and resource that's been involved in preparing facilities on Bhasan Char. I've flown over it and I've seen many presentations on this, and it's clear that it's a very impressive feat of civil engineering. We also recognise the increasing difficulties in the camps and that enabling refugees to move on a voluntary and informed basis is something that the government of Bangladesh has the right to do. But we do think it's essential for our collective ability as the international community and the government of Bangladesh to continue to support the refugees, that the humanitarian operation remains completely joined up. And we think it would be a very good idea, and we have said this multiple times, both in public and in our conversations with the government, that the movement of refugees, any movement of refugees that might take place, should be preceded by separate UN technical assessment and protection missions, which would give the government and donors a common evidence base in planning longer term support for a possible refugee population on Bhasan Char. Because nobody, and least of all the refugees, would benefit from a difference of approach at a time when humanitarian resources are very stretched around the world. So we very much hope that it will be possible for the United Nations, the major donors, the government, to remain completely joined up on the approach to Bhasan Char. And as I said, we think the first thing that should happen would be an assessment mission by the UN so that we have a common evidence base to assess the viability and cost of hosting the refugee population. And then we think a protection mission should go as soon as possible in order to talk to the refugees who've been living in Bhasan Char for the last 6 or 7 months. So that's where we stand. As I said, it's a huge crisis. We remain very closely engaged as the UK. We recognise the intractability of this issue, but we think that the elements are there which should eventually enable safe, dignified and voluntary return to take place. And in the meantime, we think it's crucial that a joined up, effective humanitarian operation continues. And we remain enormously grateful to the people of Bangladesh and the host communities for their extraordinary generosity in continuing to host a very large number of refugees. And we'll be working with the government and with others to try to make sure that the refugees stay in Bangladesh is no longer than it needs to be. And just finally, I'd just like to say again, thank you very much to our hosts today for convening this second international conference on the Rohingya crisis. And I hope you will have a very productive and enlightening 2 days. And I look forward to hearing some of the sessions and to seeing the outcomes. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Robert, for a very comprehensive presentation. Let me go straight to our chief guest, Honorable Foreign Secretary, Mr. Masood bin Moment. And we'll see whether we have some time so that we can come back to Robert if there's some questions from the platform. But now let us hear the Honorable Foreign Secretary first. Mr. Masood bin Moment, it's all yours. You are still muted.
Thank you, Professor Imtiaz of the Genocide Studies Center of Dhaka University, and also the distinguished co-chairs of this conference, particularly Professor Peter, Director and colleagues of UCL IRDR, and also His Excellency Robert Chatterton Dixon, British High Commissioner to Bangladesh, for his very comprehensive laying out of the problem for us. Esteemed panelists and excellencies. I'm happy to be part of this second international conference in the Rohingya crisis in comparative perspective. Such international conferences are important platforms to reflect on the Rohingya situation and can help generate meaningful ideas towards a durable solution of the crisis. The Rohingyas are one of the most persecuted people on earth. For generations, they have been subjected to state policies of deprivation, discrimination, exclusion, and disenfranchisement. Cycles of violence in the last 6 decades have forced these persecuted people flee their homeland, Myanmar, multiple times. In the process, we saw exodus of Rohingyas in Bangladesh in 1978, 91, 92, 2012, 2016, and the latest in 2017. Currently, we are hosting nearly 1 million Rohingyas from Myanmar, which include around 800,000 who came in 2017 and some 300,000 remnants from the previous exoduses. Bangladesh is no longer in a position to continue to take this colossal burden of hosting the Rohingyas, as the situation is increasingly becoming untenable, both for the Rohingyas as well as for the host communities. Although with the timely intervention of the government and our partners and the frontline humanitarian health workers in the camps, the COVID fallout could be kept to its minimum. However, risks of various sorts are increasing all the time, nevertheless. At this point of time, the only priority of Bangladesh is the sustainable return of the Rohingyas to Myanmar. Unfortunately, our sincere efforts of the last 3 years have not resulted in any single repatriation. Despite early conclusion of bilateral agreement with Myanmar, the process of repatriation faced a number of stumbling blocks. First one being the failure on the part of Myanmar to keep the promises it made in the bilateral instrument, the lack of conducive environment, which again Myanmar promised to ensure in the agreement, has not been realized. No tangible efforts by Myanmar have been taken so far for the creation of favorable environment for the Rohingyas to return. The underlying conditions that originally led to this exodus still prevails and remains unaddressed mostly. In addition to that, we have been unfortunately witnessing international community's policy of accommodation, appeasement, and business as usual approach, which are only emboldening the Myanmar authorities to maintain the status quo. The UN and the international community appear to be more keen on addressing the humanitarian aspects of the crisis in Bangladesh instead of investing and focusing on repatriation and the permanent solution of this crisis. The Honorable Prime Minister of Bangladesh, Sheikh Hasina, has all along maintained that the Rohingya problem was created by Myanmar and any solution of the problem has to be found in Myanmar. When all countries shrugged off their humanitarian responsibility of saving the lives of these persecuted Rohingyas, it was only Bangladesh and its humane Prime Minister who shouldered the responsibility and opened its borders. Since then, Bangladesh has been doing its utmost to ensure their upkeep despite her own challenges. While these people are in Bangladesh, we have not forgotten about their future in Myanmar and accordingly are preparing them for reintegration into their society in Myanmar after their return. To that end, we have allowed education in the camps imparted through Myanmar curricula in Myanmar language. The government of Bangladesh, from its own resources, even developed Bhasan Chor for relocation of some Rohingyas. The relocation, which is currently underway, is a part of our broader repatriation plan. In Bhasan Chor, the Rohingyas will have the opportunities of developing livelihood skills like agriculture, fishing, poultry rearing, etc. These skills would help them to undertake economic activities on their return to Myanmar and their eventual integration into the Myanmar society. This relocation is also meant to decongest the camps in Cox's Bazar and de-risk the trafficking and other security-related threats. While Bangladesh has made all arrangements for the repatriation, regrettably, we do not see any sincere efforts from the Myanmar side for repatriation. Myanmar must focus the core issues of safety, security, basic rights, freedom of movement, and economic opportunities for the Rohingyas. It must demonstrate that the situation that caused the exodus has been reversed through tangible actions verified by international civilian observers or confidence builders, perhaps spearheaded by the ASEAN, of whom it's a member, or also its neighbors like China or India or even Japan and the Republic of Korea. So far, Myanmar has failed to win confidence of the prospective returnees. Lack of trust remains the most formidable barrier to start the repatriation process. To address this gap, Myanmar should engage with the Rohingyas to mitigate the trust deficit. This is important to infuse confidence in the Rohingyas in the camps, which should encourage them to return. As a part of confidence building measures and in line with the directives of the ICJ, Myanmar should preserve the Rohingya land and villages in their original shapes as well as restore those which have already been demolished. The ability of the Rohingyas to return to their original places of residence would be a big confidence booster. We see all the commendable work done on the accountability fronts in the perspective of confidence building. In addition, Rohingyas must have a basis of hope for a decent living in Myanmar, and this has to be created by Myanmar through addressing the root causes of the problem in a time-bound manner, as recommended by the Kofi Annan Commission report. For example, granting civil and political rights, including citizenship, security guarantee, freedom of movement, livelihood opportunities, as well as reconciliation and reintegration of Rohingyas into Myanmar society. At the same time, Myanmar has to work more intensively with the UN and the international community. As of now, Myanmar is giving a limited access to the UN, which is not helping the cause of a durable solution. With regard to the responsibility of the international community vis-a-vis Rohingya crisis, I'd like to highlight that first and foremost, the international community's approach to Myanmar, which appears to be predominantly shaped by their own geopolitical, economic, and business interests, must change. This is unfortunate that countries that have leverage to influence Myanmar are neither unwilling to use it or maintaining a policy of appeasement and accommodation. This must end. Secondly, international community should meaningfully engage with Myanmar to ensure that the Rohingyas can enjoy their basic civil, political, and economic rights in Myanmar. It is also critical that at the end of the tunnel, the Rohingyas must see a light, that there is a clear time-bound consultative pathway to citizenship for them. Thirdly, international community should work with Myanmar to ensure the presence of an international civilian observation team. Fourthly, instead of disproportionately focusing on the humanitarian efforts in Bangladesh, they should replicate such efforts to protect the existing Rohingyas, some 600,000, in Myanmar, as well as to create conditions favorable for other Rohingyas to return. In conclusion, I would like to flag that delay in repatriation had its own ramifications, not only for Bangladesh, but also for the whole region and beyond. We can already see the manifestation in the form of growing frustration leading to violence and unrest, risk of trafficking and radicalization. The prolongation of the crisis for an indefinite period has all the potentials to destabilize the region. While the humanitarian-focused approach may provide temporary relief, it does not help in resolving the crisis. Rather, sincere and targeted approach by all stakeholders, with everyone fulfilling their commitments and responsibilities, is essential for a lasting solution. We all, including the vibrant Rohingya diaspora all over the world, must intensify our efforts to ameliorate the sad fate of these persecuted people. With the election in Myanmar out of the way, we hope we can give repatriation another fresh chance very soon. I thank you all.
Thank you very much, Mr. Masud bin Momen. We still have some time. Uh, I think we can open the floor for some questions, and both the Foreign Secretary and His Excellency Mr. Dixon hopefully can respond. So the floor is open. You can raise your hand, or you can start speaking, or you can send questions and we can relay them to both the keynote speakers and the chief guest. Please go ahead. Yes,
There's
Bias,
a
go ahead.
question. There's a question in the chat box.
Okay. You want to read that out, Bias, please?
Yes, saying how much this refugee crisis is considered as a security issue for Bangladesh. Is it a security threat for Bangladesh? That's the question.
Okay. Can we take one or two more, and then both Robert and Mr. Momin can come back? Go ahead.
First of all, thank you very much on behalf of the Rohingya community for exhibiting strong support by the government of Bangladesh and the government of UK. I sincerely appreciate on the depth of gratitude for the Rohingya people. My question would be to both His Excellency Mr. Robert and the Foreign Secretary Masood bin Momen, that if you go back to the history 20 years ago, and there was a similar issues in Indonesia, then during that particular time there was an intervention initiated by UN and possibly Australia. Whether that's kind of scenario is applicable in the crisis of Rohingya issue, in the plight of Rohingya issue. Just it's a question that I would like to pose to both of you. Thank you very much.
Okay, let's take one more and then we come to the speakers. Please go ahead.
There is a question from Nisa Orin.
Okay.
Saying, I have a question for Masood sir. If the Bangladesh government has arranged the Bhashanchar Island properly for the Rohingya, then why the government is unable to send an apparent report to the UN and other significant humanitarian international institutions? So it's about Bhashanchar and why you are failing to convince UN and other international organizations.
Okay, good. I think let me once again invite the High Commissioner Robert. Are you
Can I
there
go
still?
first because
Oh, you want to go? Okay, go. Please,
because
Masood, go.
my battery is dying for some reason.
Okay, okay. No,
Yeah.
Masood, you go ahead. Go ahead and then, yeah.
Thank you, Robert, for deferring. No, I think all the questions are important. First question, definitely security threat, not only for Bangladesh, for Cox's Bazar region, but in fact for the entire region and beyond, as I said in my statement, because there are multiple risk factors. One is the longer these people are there in the camps, there will be more frustrations and hopelessness, and that will, create a condition conducive for all sorts of risks, whether it is trafficking of human persons, children, women, girls, or whether trafficking of drugs or small arms. So everything together, and also the radicalization aspect, potential. And we have seen in the recent past the gang warfare or the warfare or some sort of clashes to exert or establish influence of particular groups. So these are all manifestations that serious risks are looming. So that's why unless immediate measures are taken, we have taken measures to sort of have the camps surrounded by fencing, which will physically obstruct untoward or criminal or miscreant elements to come and go to the camps and do their activities, especially after the sunset. So that is from our part, our response. But definitely there is a big risk. With Dr. Haramin's question of whether something can be done in line with, I think he referred to East Timor. But for that, we will be needing Security Council unanimous action. And we have been seeing in the past that Security Council has not been ready to take such concrete actions, not even a single resolution, despite the serious efforts of the penholders, the British mission in New York, with whom we worked very closely. The last question is, of course, very important. We have been talking about relocation of some Rohingyas to Bhashanchar in the recent months or throughout this year. And we saw that when hundreds of desperate Rohingyas were found in the Andaman Sea or beyond, no one came to their rescue, and it was the Bangladesh Navy and our Coast Guards who rescued these hapless women and children and men from the sea, and they were brought to Bashan Chor, but they didn't want to stay there, and so we decided to take them back to the camps. But at the same time, we were always getting the indication that there were some Rohingyas who would be voluntarily interested to go to the Bashan Chor, much better facility in terms of physical conditions. So we have found quite a few families there, especially in the wake of the recent security and law and order situation, who are willing to give it a shot. So right now they are being taken to Bashan Chor as we speak, and the UN has been kept informed. And there are two missions from the UN which will be undertaken soon. One is a kind of a protection mission. Once these people are there, then we'll take the UN to talk to them and see how they're doing there. And then the bigger, more technical or feasible study kind of a mission, which will be undertaken sometime next year. So we are not doing this in a non-transparent manner or behind the back of anybody, but totally voluntarily. And also once these people are there, a little bit settled, we have taken a lot of our local journalists in the last few weeks, and they have all expressed their satisfaction. In fact, some professors also went there. I remember Dr. Sadeka Halim of Dhaka University, she also went. And very soon we'll be also taking some of the volunteer ambassadors, high commissioners who would be willing, because the season is good now. So we can take them maybe, if not December, but definitely in January. So we will take everybody on board in this endeavor. But this is, again, a very temporary solution to the bigger problem. The bigger problem is, of course, the repatriation of all these people back to their homeland, that is the Rakhine province of Myanmar. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Momin. Thank you. Let us now let's listen to the response of Mr. Dixon. Your Excellency, it's all yours.
Thank you very much. Well, I think on a lot of these things, as so often, the Foreign Secretary and I are violently agreeing, because I think we absolutely share the government's view that what is needed is repatriation under the right conditions soon. I think in answer to the three questions, I think the Foreign Secretary has given a very good answer about the security implications of having 1 million people in camps. I would add to that, at different times in my career, I've also visited other camps of people who've been displaced for long periods from their original homes. And there's no question that people in that sort of situation are vulnerable to extremism and radicalization. We've seen that with people like the Palestinians in other contexts. So I think there obviously are immediate issues around criminality, drug smuggling, people trafficking, all of those things. But there is definitely also a risk from the sort of longer term alienation of people who are left in a situation where they can't see hope for themselves and their families. So I think, I totally agree that there is a serious security problem now, and there is potentially an even more serious security problem down the track if this problem is not solved. On the second issue about, the intervention in East Timor was a very specific response to a very specific situation. I think it's hard to imagine something exactly like that working in these circumstances, not least because, as Foreign Secretary, of course, with first-hand experience of this, will know the Security Council is pretty divided at the moment. But I do think that the UN has played a part in resolving other crises in a sort of less dramatic way than it did in East Timor. And again, I think, there are other examples in Southeast Asia. If we think of the sort of 70s and 80s, there were huge refugee populations in Southeast Asia, and now there aren't. So there are definitely solutions that can be developed and definitely precedents that can be examined at events like this, which can demonstrate ways in which the international community, the host government, the government that needs to receive people back, can work together to resolve these crises. So I think the wider precedent is there, but I think the East Timor precedent is probably not directly one that we can use at the moment. And in terms of Basan Char, I mean, I'm very encouraged by what the Foreign Secretary said about early protection mission and an early technical mission. I mean, I think those two things would be very good because, as I've said, I mean, Basan Char might be a perfectly good place for refugee populations, but what we need is an evidence base which we put together, which could be provided by the UN, which could form the basis for an agreed approach between the government and the donor community and the refugees themselves. And I think, you know, having those UN missions at a very early stage would be very good, because that would give an authoritative baseline that we could all work off. And I mean, as an ambassador, I'd be very interested in going to Basan Char, but I'm not a technical expert or a protection expert. So I think I'm not sure I would add much value if I went there. What we need is a proper expert assessment that is led by the UN and that can form a baseline for us then to reach a common solution. Because as I said, I think it's crucial in a world of difficult choices and stretched resources that all the different stakeholders, including the government here and the international community and the Rohingyas themselves, remain joined up if we're going to make the most and best use of limited resources.
Thank you very much. I think there are still more questions, but we are almost running out of time for the inaugural session, and we have a session after 10 minutes break or so. But let me invite the co-chair now. If Peter wants to say something. Peter, you want to say something? Peter, are you there?
I just want to say we have 10 more minutes.
Oh, you okay?
Yeah. So.
Okay. Also, we can take some more questions.
Yes, we have 6 more questions. Let me read out.
Okay. Can you please read out, please?
Yeah, the first one from Anonymous. It's a very critical question. I'm not sure how it fits here, but it's about someone is asking whether the Rohingya crisis would influence India to do the same to the Muslims of Ashram in terms of their new CAA and NRC. And the second is one from Tekang, saying a few months. The Tekang wants to know the updates on the Gambia happened to have taken Myanmar to the ICC with most of the members of the OIC, and Tekang wants to know what's the update on the verdict till date. It should be, I think, ICJ, not ICC. The third question is again from Anis Ullah about Bhasan Char. Why Bangladesh government is forcing to relocate them to Bhasan Char? Okay. Yes. Fourth one from Atif Ahmed. It's about again on Bhasan Char. Whether it would create any host or refugee crisis nearby that island. Probably Atif is mentioning whether it would create any coastal community like the local Bengali coastal communities and refugee conflict. And last question from Tanzir Rani about the host community in Bangladesh, in Cox's Bazar, is now greatly frustrated. Is there any potential for conflict between Rohingya and host community? Is on Cox's, and another, it seems like the coastal community near Bhasan Char and areas. So these are the few questions. Thank you.
Good. The Foreign Secretary, you want to go again first, given your
Yes.
less battery.
3%. Okay. No, I mean, there are a number of questions on Bhasan Char. So firstly, I would like to reassure everybody listening that we are not forcing anybody to go to Bhasan Char. If we had actually used force, then we could have done it much earlier. But we temporarily rescued these people, 306 from the sea, and they were kept there initially. Of course, they wanted to be with their families, so we are arranging that. Meanwhile, we got quite a few number of families who were willing to go to Bashan Chor. And again, if they don't like it after going there, they can always come back. It's not Alcatraz or somewhere where they cannot escape or something like that. As there are no host population as such in Bashan Chor itself, so I don't see any conflict of host community and the Rohingyas in Bashan Chor. But of course, in the Cox's Bazar area itself, the sympathy of the host community has been waning over the last few months. We have seen, especially the prices of commodities have been increasing, the cost of living increasing, the labor cost decreasing. So all these things, and of course the environment was being affected in major ways, and also the criminality factor. All these led to frustration of the host community in Cox's Bazar. So obviously that was in our mind when we were thinking of relocating some of the Rohingyas to Bashan Chor. The question on ICJ's verdict, of course, it has given a provisional ruling. It's a long way forward. Some people say that it could take 4 to 5 years for the actual verdict to come out, but the process is now underway. Countries, or in this case Myanmar, is supposed to be reporting on progress, and ICJ will evaluate that, and there will be more court proceedings in the coming months. So obviously this would be a long drawn process. On the question, the first question of the NRC and situation in Assam, and whether we could see something similar in the future, I don't want to prejudge. That is particularly an internal matter of India, and they have assured us time and again that this is a domestic matter, and Bangladesh has nothing to worry from this one. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before I call upon Robert, there's one comment that let me read it out, which might help Robert to respond. Well, there are also one question. The comment is from Dr. Rafiqul Islam of Department of Peace and Conflict Studies, University of Dhaka. He said that I have visited Bhashan Chor and I confirm that it's a suitable and viable place to relocate the Rohingya people from Cox's Bazar to there temporarily. Okay, so he's one of those few who has visited and is giving his opinion. And the second is from Mustafa Dambuya, also I think addressed to Robert, and that is, why is UN only concerned with humanitarian support but ignoring the lasting solution ranging from peaceful repatriation and integration in the Arakan? Robert, it's all yours.
Thank you very much. Well, I think the Foreign Secretary and I have sort of said pretty much what there is to be said about Bashan Char. We acknowledge that these are not forced relocations. We totally acknowledge the impact that the refugees have on the communities nearby. We can understand why there's a desire to relieve some of the pressure. And I can understand why, for some people in the camps, moving to Bashan Char might be an attractive option. But as I said, what we would like to do is a question of sequencing. And we think that while I would obviously defer to the person who's been to Bashan Char and I haven't, clearly what is being proposed is moving a large number of vulnerable people to an island, to a char in a part of the world with historic vulnerability to cyclones. And I think what is needed is a serious civil engineering expert mission to go to see whether this is a safe thing to do. And it may well be that it is. That would be a very good thing to find out. But until we have that that stamp of approval from genuine experts, then I think we we would question whether this is whether this is something that should be pressed ahead with. There's also, of course, the issue of cost, because keeping people in Bhasan Char is likely, as it's an island, to be more expensive. And as I noted earlier on, I mean, resources are very stretched for humanitarian crises worldwide. The world is dealing with a crisis right across the world, from Africa through Yemen, and the Rohingyas are a significant one, but they're not the only one. And it will be important to make sure that by moving people to Bhasan Char, we weren't, if you like, making resource commitments that it would be difficult then to follow through. So for all of those reasons, we think that what is needed, as I've said, is for the UN to go, UN experts, UN civil engineering experts, to look at the walls, look at the way that the camp has been put together, and make sure that it's genuinely a safe place for people to be in the sort of climatic conditions that we all know come up in the Bay of Bengal. Just two other things. I mean, the question about the Gambia and the case that they brought they and the OIC have brought in the ICJ. I mean, I think that's one of the means of pressure that can be put on Myanmar. I mean, clearly, the ability of the international community to put pressure on sovereign states is not limitless, but I think it is unwelcome to Myanmar, as we saw from the fact that Daw Aung San Suu Kyi herself felt she had to go to The Hague to defend her government. So, I think we should recognise that there is a lot of evidence being collected, and there are different processes and sanctions playing out, and none of this is going to go away for the government of Myanmar, however much they may not like it, until they take serious steps to resolve this crisis. So we hope that they'll recognise that it is in their interests to do so. And I mean, the final question about the UN, I mean, the UN is focused on the humanitarian operation because that is the responsibility of UNHCR and IOM and other parts of the UN family. And I think, one has to acknowledge the extraordinary effectiveness of that response. It's obviously not within the gift of the UN to do things that the government of Myanmar does not accept on the other side of the border, because, as we've noted, the international community is quite divided on this. But I suspect that if a political agreement could be arrived at, then the UN, as it has in other humanitarian crises, would have an important part in enabling the Rohingyas to return home by being able to provide civilian monitoring or other enablers which have played a part in resolving other refugee crises along the lines that I'm sure you're going to be talking about in this setting over the next few days.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We have already come to the end of our time for the inaugural session. But let me once again thank His Excellency, the British High Commissioner, Mr. Robert Chatterton-Dixon, and also the Honorable Foreign Secretary, Mr. Masud bin Momen, for giving us your understanding of things. I'm sure the questions are endless. There have been still people are putting questions, and that's a good thing. More questions, more debate, more difference of opinion. I think that's very healthy. I'm sure the next 2 days, some of the questions that have been raised would be responded by some of the key people who have been working on Rohingyas for years. I know some of them for almost, my God, 2-3 decades working on the Rohingya issues. So they're all involved in the next 2 days. So stay with us. I understand physical presence would have made this conference very different. Last year we had it in London, so it made an impact. But this time, they say every crisis is an opportunity. The opportunity is that we could bring more people all around the world, and there are at one point there were more than 100 people listening to the Foreign Secretary and also the British High Commissioner, their understanding of the Rohingya crisis. So thank you once again. We now go for a break for 5 or 10 minutes, and we come back again for the first working session. Thank you all.
Thank you also.
Thank you very much, Imtiaz. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Bias, you want to take over? Bias, it's all yours.
Yes, thank you, Professor Imtiaz, for moderating this session. And from UCL and Dhaka University, we want to thank Robert and Mr. Masud bin Monem. Now we will take just 10 minutes break. We'll be back at 11:30 GMT. Just after 10 minutes, I would request the attendees to be just pause or mute yourself, and we'll be back in 10 minutes with Professor Amena Mohsin in her session on the impact of COVID-19 in the camps. See you again in 10 minutes. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you.